Well, welcome to everybody who is here already to this webinar entitled Title Deeds to the Holy Land. Please note the question mark at the end of that sentence. My name is John Parkin. I'm an Irish Methodist minister and also the chairperson of Kairos Ireland. Kairos Ireland is part of Global Kairos for Justice, which takes its inspiration from the Palestinian Christians in Kairos, Palestine. We try to share their insights and concerns with churches in Ireland. We cooperate with the many movements and organizations in Ireland that are concerned to work for an end to the illegal occupation of Palestine by Israel. Our speaker tonight is the Reverend Dr. Nicholas Taylor, who is a biblical scholar at the School of Divinity, Edinburgh University. Dr. Taylor was born in South Africa and has researched and taught in universities in Southern Africa, England, and Scotland. He has published numerous scholarly papers, including papers on the rights of the early church and issues of anti-Semitism and the New Testament. He is a priest of the Scottish Episcopal Church. He serves in a parish in Glasgow, but he has a strong concern for peace and justice in Palestine, Israel. He served for 3 years as chairperson of the Scottish Palestine Forum, and until recently, he was the coordinator of the Sabeel Kairos UK theology group. He's recently been appointed as the convener of the Doctrine Committee of the Scottish Episcopal Church. We've asked Nicholas to address the subject, title deeds to the Holy Land. Why title deeds? Well, this goes back to the Royal Peel Commission, a pre-war commission to explore the causes of conflict in British Mandate Palestine between the indigenous population and the recent Jewish immigrants. In 1937, Lord Peel met with David Ben-Gurion of the Zionist Jewish Agency. Peel said he could understand why Arabs who were born in the province and whose forebears had lived there for generations, claiming that the land was theirs. But by what right did a person like Ben-Gurion, who was born in Poland, claim the land as his? It's said that Ben-Gurion picked up a copy of the Bible and said, in effect, "These are our title deeds." The same sentiment was echoed more recently by the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon. In a speech to the UN Security Council, he held up a copy of the Bible and said, "This is the deed to our land." Dr. Taylor will examine some of the land claims in Genesis. He will look at the conquest narratives in the book of Joshua, Ben-Gurion's favorite book. He will examine some aspects of the Hebrew prophetic tradition. This talk is being recorded and will be made available after the event. Questions may be written in the chat box, and we'll try to collate them and make them available for a period after the end of Nicholas's talk. Nicholas, I hand over to you, and I look forward to what you have to share with us.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I am conscious that in previous centuries, invasions of Ireland from Scotland as well as from England led to occupation, dispossession, and destitution bordering on genocide, justified by ideologies of election, which violated the ethics of the Hebrew Scriptures and the fundamentals of Christian doctrine, which the British state at the time professed. I would have to confess that among those invaders were some of my forebears, some of whom had been refugees from persecution in France, and whose descendants later received compensation for the manumission of their slaves in Jamaica. To compound my heritage further, I grew up in apartheid South Africa, where my mother was descended from another family of Huguenot refugees. I am therefore genetically disqualified from speaking across the Irish Sea on such issues, and so appreciate very specially the generosity of your invitation. History is complicated, and the formulation of theological principles on the basis of what has been received as sacred history even more so. The longer ago the events, the less evidence is likely to have survived in contemporary records or in archaeological relics. The documents we have received as scripture date from later than the events they record, and nowhere is this more true than of the patriarchal narratives in Genesis, the account of the Exodus from Egypt, and the collection of books sometimes known as the Deuteronomic history. These texts, written several centuries after the events they relate, may incorporate earlier records, but these are notoriously difficult to identify or to locate geographically or chronologically. Oral traditions on which authors may have drawn may be very ancient, but elude reconstruction. I will therefore make no attempt to identify particular verses of the Bible as deriving from JEDP or any other hypothetical source. Any scholarly consensus on such issues has given way to a plethora of views and increasing acknowledgement of uncertainty. While selectively reading particular verses at face value, i.e. tendentiously, while ignoring any which inconveniently suggest anything else, is the refuge of fundamentalists. We are nonetheless, as Christians, heirs to a canon of Scripture which includes those verses, and there are many of them, which promise land to Abraham, Jacob, and through Moses to the nation of Israel, or the throne thereof to David and his descendants, and which promise restoration of that which had been lost through the later prophets. Time does not permit a study of all relevant verses, and I will therefore confine myself to examples. Firstly, accounts of the promises made to Abraham. Secondly, dissonant accounts of the occupation of Canaan by Israel. And thirdly, prophetic hopes of restoration, anticipating and reflecting on the destruction of the Hebrew kingdoms, including Jerusalem and the shrine commonly known as the First Temple. Reference to the Bible as title deeds to the land variously known as Canaan, Israel, Ebenlar, Judea, Syria, Palestina, Sha'am, Outremer, or Palestine originated not as an expression of Jewish piety in modern legal jargon, but as cynical and very effective manipulation of Christians by secular atheistic Zionists. The testimony of David Ben-Gurion, at that time chairman of the Jewish Agency, to the Peel Commission in 1936, is usually cited as the first instance of this usage, as John has mentioned already. More recently, as he also mentioned, similar claims were made by an Israeli ambassador addressing the United Nations, also using the Bible as a stage prop. The expression has been seized with religious fervour by evangelical Christian Zionists and with opportunistic and Machiavellian posturing by Israeli politicians. Title deeds are associated with formal transactions whereby property is transferred from one owner to another, whether by purchase or by gift, but not by theft. Abraham's purchase of the cave of Machpelah as a grave for his wife is the classic example. The negotiations between the bereaved nomad and urban landowner transacted and witnessed in a culturally appropriate manner and recounted in some detail in Genesis 23. Later, Jacob purchases land in the vicinity of Shechem, recounted in less detail in Genesis 33, but not before having built a house and farm buildings on land at Sukkot, which he is not recorded as having purchased. This is the sum total of property acquisition in Genesis, or for that matter in the entire Pentateuch, notwithstanding the prescriptions issued to Moses at Sinai in anticipation of the occupation of Canaan. Later instances include the acquisition of Elimelech's land and of his remaining daughter-in-law as bride by Boaz in Ruth 4, and Jeremiah's redemption of family property at Anathoth during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, which was to end in destruction of both city and kingdom, and which was interpreted as a sign of future restoration. That is in Jeremiah 32. The story begins, so to speak, in Genesis 12, or does it? It has become almost conventional to distinguish between myth and history in Genesis, with the creation, flood, and Babel stories relegated to the former category, and the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, which follow, regarded as datable history involving specific people who lived at a particular time and in particular places. The punctuation of stories of human lives with accounts of divine intervention effect a transition towards a world history in which God is perceived as being less active. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are more complex than is often appreciated, reflecting a long tradition of oral transmission in which diverse traditions have become conflated into a single national epic, without losing such dissonant features as different names for God, the same story told of different people, chronological inconsistencies not resolved by the lifespans attributed to central figures. We might compare the patriarchal narratives in Genesis with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the Arthurian legends, or the Celtic mythological cycles. The lives and exploits of real people undoubtedly gave rise to many of the stories, and the way of life depicted is consistent with what is known of society and culture of the period. But the same stories have been recounted in different order and with different details, including the names of central characters, in different times and places. There is no original version, no correct order of events, and association with particular places is almost always retrospective, speculative, and contested. While the patriarchal narratives are in many ways of a different order to the creation and flood narratives, they are nonetheless myths. Their truth claims lie not in a chronology of historical events they record, but in their account of God's direction of the lives of human beings in order to bring about, in this case, the nation of Israel as it was understood at the time, and in the place in which Genesis was composed. Genesis integrates the founding traditions of several tribes and clans, which had been brought together over the preceding centuries, accounting for their relationships both with each other and with their neighbours. Other and overlapping and sometimes dissonant traditions are reflected in Exodus, Joshua, and especially in Judges. It was under the patronage of the royal courts in Jerusalem and Samaria, many centuries after the times in which the events are located, that such traditions were integrated and committed to writing as an instrument of national unity under the monarchies of Judah and Israel. The story of Abraham is connected to the preceding flood narrative and to the story of Jacob which follows by genealogies adorned with anecdotes. In positing biological links between significant characters, the collection of disparate stories is woven into a single national epic. Genealogies serve also to forge links between different clans and other groups, cementing alliances and accounting for long-standing feuds. Who is in and who is out of God's covenant community is not always clear, and certainly fluctuates over the centuries, or varies according to whose perspective is reflected in the tradition. A single, politically and religiously united entity known as Israel is the much later and short-lived creation of the monarchy. To return to Genesis 12, the story is well known. Abram, as he is then known, is spoken to by God, and the name is Yahweh there, and instructed to migrate to an unknown and unidentified place with a promise of fame and nationhood, of being blessed and of being the means of God's blessing others. The land at this point is not identified. A more fundamental question, which applies to virtually every text we might consider, is quite what we mean by God speaking to a human being. Those of us who have been involved in vocational discernment have experienced just how subjective and incapable of empirical verification claims to having been called by God are. For those of us in the Anglican Episcopal tradition, we are confronted at every vacancy in C with a number of aspirants who claim to have been called by God to be the next bishop of wherever. However much we may believe that all have sincerely felt that call, at most one of them can be right. And I don't suppose I have been uniquely cynical in questioning at times whether such claims speak more of personal aspiration and ambition, and conceal a bid for power and status no less ruthless and self-serving than that of any secular politician. Population migrations along what has become known as the Fertile Crescent between Mesopotamia and Egypt have been part of the history and culture of the region since before recorded history. Nomads graze their flocks, moving according to the season in annual cycles, with drought and other climatic factors periodically disrupting established patterns. Merchants carry goods of various kinds, including other people, from place to place, following or diverging from established trade routes as opportunity and circumstance dictate. And people displaced by war or famine seek new homes in strange places. Among these patterns of movement, Abram is depicted primarily as a nomadic pastoralist, but one seeking a new home in a strange land. As the story continues, it becomes evident that Abram is chief of a not insubstantial clan, the nucleus of which is his family, his nephew Lot being next to him in authority. Their destination is identified as Canaan, and it is in the vicinity of Shechem, which is now Nablus, that God appears to Abram and promises to his descendants land of unspecified parameters. The implication of a visual experience beyond empirical verification is of course by no means unique either in the biblical narrative or in subsequent Christian tradition until the present day, and is known also in other religious traditions. Most notably, the Quran is purported to record words of God to Muhammad in a series of visions. In the next passage, Genesis 15, which particularly arouses testosterone-charged Zionists, Abram's nephew Lot has broken away, exposing the potential crisis to the remaining clan if Abram were to die without an heir. In a visionary experience, Abram is promised galactic progeny once the impediment of his not having made a start to it has been resolved. For the first time, the land is spoken of as a possession. Its parameters are defined in terms which have inspired Zionist cartography to the extent that they can convince themselves that the current territorial aspirations of Israel are really quite modest. On this scale, it is a matter of minor pedantry that the river of Egypt is not the Nile, but Wadi El Arish, which joins the Mediterranean just south of Gaza. Not only did no Israelite entity ever rule such an extensive territory, only the Abbasid Caliphate ever achieved this, but projecting the not very precise information onto a modern map is highly anachronistic. In the next passage, Genesis 17, the promise reverts to the rather more modest and superficially precise parameters of Canaan, to be inherited by a multitude of nations descended from Abram. It is at this point that circumcision becomes part of the bargain. At this stage, Abram's virility has been demonstrated through his use of Hagar as a surrogate mother after his wife Sarai has failed to produce an heir after decades of marriage. The promise of offspring through his principal wife and their changes of name follow in this pericope. While Ishmael is somewhat relegated in favour of Isaac, there is no suggestion that he would be expelled or in any way excluded from the land promised to Abraham's descendants. Isaac's birth follows the visitation to Abraham, associated by Christian tradition with the Trinity and immortalized by the icon writer Rublev. and also the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The supernatural manifestations with which these stories are replete reinforce the essentially mythic character of the patriarchal narratives. Even the earthy story of a drunken Lot seduced in turn by his daughters, who give birth to the eponymous ancestors of the Ammonites and Midianites, is the stuff of myth rather than history. God's having promised an unspecified stretch of land to Abraham is referred to several times in subsequent chapters of Genesis, in the stories of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and also in the account of Abraham's dispatching a servant to the home of his brother to find a wife for Isaac, Genesis 24. So, not before the servants being required to grab at Abraham's testicles while making an oath. If this gesture had been retained in courtroom protocols rather than being replaced with the Bible, Ben-Gurion's claim to the title deeds would have had a somewhat different resonance. To turn to the emergence of Israel and its occupation of Canaan, irrespective of whether or not Abraham ever existed, the nation of Israel was formed not through his geriatric fecundity and the generally more enthusiastic procreative activity of his descendants, but through a series of social, economic, and political reconfigurations of the Canaanite polities over several centuries. As with the patriarchal narratives, the Old Testament presents a single unified narrative of the exodus from Egypt to the formation of the monarchy and the subsequent rise and fall of the two Hebrew kingdoms. Scholarship over the last century, informed by archaeology as well as by textual studies, has discerned three distinct patterns, of which the genocidal exploits of Joshua are only one. Evidence is attested also of more peaceful, or at least less gratuitously violent, patterns of migration, of people of rather more diverse origin than a single extended biological family, mainly pastoralists gradually adopting a more sedentary pattern of life. And there were also agrarian peasant uprisings against the city-states, some of which resulted in migrations to the hill country and a life of banditry, while others succeeded in retaining control of the land they had inhabited and establishing agricultural settlements in the lowlands. Genealogies functioned as an instrument of unity and common identity as groups came together and gradually informed larger units capable of organizing at least limited defense against the predatory and repressive city-states. There were undoubtedly population migrations along the Fertile Crescent, wandering Arameans, as the Deuteronomist calls them, Deuteronomy 26:5, and pastoral nomads competed with agrarian societies for land and water. Immigration of escaped slaves from Egypt perhaps provided a minor catalyst, but not the demographic mass of whatever tribal configuration subsisted under Philistine suzerainty after the decline of the Egyptian, Mycenaean, and Hittite empires, and before the resurgence of the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Egyptian empires during the period approximately 1400 to 1000 before the Common Era. The people of ancient Israel were Canaanites, subject to the various city-states which rose and fell over the centuries as vassals of the more powerful empires. Israel came about through social revolutions which overthrew the city-states or saw the peasant populations migrate to the hill country and form less hierarchical and less militarized pastoral and agricultural societies, resisting the rule of the surviving city-states and of neighboring Arameans, Phoenicians, and Philistines, as happened also during this period in Ammon, Moab, and Edom, lands to the east of the Jordan and to the south of what became Judea. The Book of Judges preserves the traditions of several such movements of localized uprisings and wars of liberation, with freedom always relative and precarious under the protection of Yahweh. Figures such as Deborah, Barak, Gideon, and Samson emerged as folk heroes. Not all such uprisings would have been successful, and those which initially prevailed against the military strength of the city-states and their overlords would have endured only for as long as they were able to graze their flocks and grow sufficient food crops to survive in the hill country, difficult but not impossible for an army to penetrate. The viability of a relatively egalitarian society, provided one was male and slave-owning, against encroachment from the city-states was fragile, and generated pressure towards more permanent and centralized military and political structures. The monarchy under Saul was localized and tentative. The extent of David's kingdom is less certain than the ways in which the monarchy was fundamentally to alter the character of Israelite society, creating an exploitative and militarized agrarian society, as Samuel is credited with having foreseen. 1 Samuel 8:11-18. David may have been little more than a warlord with a sideline in banditry, and his vices may have been proportionately fewer than is related in 2 Samuel. David is nonetheless credited with having brought together the diversity of tribal and cultic entities and integrated their epics and genealogies to create a nation with a common ancestry whose cultic life was centered on Jerusalem. The dissolution of the 2 Hebrew kingdoms by the Assyrians, Samaria in 722 BC, and the Babylonians, Jerusalem in 587 BCE, and the consequent population migrations altered permanently the character of Israel. Between these 2 events came the brief but enduring reforms of Josiah, which consolidated the national epic and initiated the Deuteronomistic movement. The shrine of El at Bethel was desecrated and destroyed, and cultic worship centralized in Jerusalem. As Josiah extended his territory, include some of the former northern kingdom, monotheism and laws of social responsibility became established, which were to endure long after the kingdom was destroyed, and to be the foundation of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim ethics thereafter. The exiles from Samaria and Jerusalem, far from being enforced mass population migrations, consisted of no more than the removal of the ruling classes, royal and priestly, from the people they ruled, and of conscripts of the imperial armies and labour gangs, estimated at no more than 10% of the population. Nevertheless, the Babylonian exile was an experience of profound significance in the development of Judaism. The crisis of separation from the land of Israel enabled profound new theological insights to be reached by the prophets of the period, Ezekiel in particular, Psalm 137 also an important window there. There were to be of quite fundamental significance for both Judaism and Christianity in later centuries, but the ears upon which they fell at the time were either deaf or politically disenfranchised. What was heard was expressions of hope of restoration when God would turn the fortunes of the exiles, allowing them to return to their ancestral land and re-establish a powerful kingdom. It needs to be remembered that the prophets lived in a particular period in Israel's history, reflected on the experience of Israel and in the world of that time, and sought to discern God's purposes against that environment. Christian theology has subsequently found fulfillment of many of the same prophetic texts in the life and ministry of Jesus, and adapted these readings further in the light of the eschatological passages in the New Testament, to speak of a future return of Jesus in glory, finally triumphing over God's enemies and establishing a kingdom either in this world or in a replacement of created once this has been obliterated. Christian Zionists have read into these traditions since the 17th century a notion that the Jewish people, wherever they might be living at the time, should return to their ancestral land as a prerequisite to the return of Christ. There they would either be converted or perish in an eschatological inferno. All these ideas are far from the vision of the prophets of the Old Testament, whose concerns and whose hopes were very much more immediate. Time does not allow us to consider all relevant passages in any detail, so I will cite just a few examples, if I can get this to move. To begin with Jeremiah 29, a passage set in the period between what is commonly known as the first exile in 597 BCE, when the Babylonians had exiled certain of the ruling class and their retainers from Jerusalem to Babylon, but before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586. Jeremiah offers assurance of future restoration, but cautions that this would not be until 70 years, an approximate and symbolic period, had passed. He warns against any expectation of imminent deliverance, such as was to foment the rebellion which led to total destruction a few years later. Return from exile may be hoped for, but God's hand cannot be forced to precipitate this. There is no sense in which this passage can be read to refer to Jesus or to any events in our present day. Reference is to the geopolitics of the early 6th century before the Common Era and the prospects of exile from Jerusalem in Babylon at that time. To turn to a passage set some decades later, where the fortunes of the resurgent Babylonian Empire, which had destroyed Jerusalem, were waning, and the Medo-Persian Empire of Cyrus was on the ascendant. The armies of Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 before the Common Era and established an empire which was to dominate southwestern Asia until the rise of Alexander 2 centuries later. This text is significant in naming one who is not a worshipper of the God of Israel as the Lord's anointed, the Messiah. Isaiah identifies the God he worships, and in whose name he prophesies as the source of Cyrus' power, and claims furthermore that the well-being of Israel is the purpose for which God had anointed, in other words, bestowed his spirit upon Cyrus. Cyrus did indeed introduce changes to imperial policy, and people who had been forcibly removed from their homelands were permitted to return and to establish polities with limited autonomy under Persian suzerainty. There is no possibility this passage can be referring to Jesus, to events in the present day, or to any events or expectation of events beyond its immediate future. Just as Isaiah reflects exilic hopes of restoration in the near future, so too does Ezekiel. Zechariah similarly reflects the far from ideal conditions which prevailed in Jerusalem during the period after initial parties of exiles had returned and attempted to rebuild their lives, or reconstruct their forebears' lives there. Prophecy gives way to the lurid language and imagery which would become characteristic of later apocalyptic writings. I conclude with Isaiah 61, a passage dating from much the same period. Trito Isaiah, remembered most perhaps for referring to Israel as a light to the Gentiles, is also author of another passage which the evangelist Luke and the Christian church thereafter have seen fulfilled in Jesus. This is the passage from which Jesus read in the synagogue in Nazareth, and whose fulfillment he proclaimed, and in so doing aroused the wrath of the hitherto receptive congregation. Trito Isaiah's somewhat triumphalist expectations were certainly not fulfilled in his day. But this does not mean that Jesus' interpretation and appropriation of the passage does not involve some radical reinterpretation. There is no triumphalism in Jesus' act of fulfillment, no subordination of the nations to Israel, but proclamation of justice, healing, and liberty, ending in his crucifixion. There can be no place in Christian hope for a political and military superpower representing the interests of one group against another. However we may understand or wish to mitigate the supersessionism of the Apostle Paul and other New Testament writers, we nonetheless proclaim that Christ has broken down the dividing wall which had separated people one from another, and in particular Jews from people of other nations. Rebuilding walls, repression and genocide play no part in God's saving work. Whatever atrocities were perpetrated in God's name by anyone in the past, we are called to be disciples of Jesus, not Joshua.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for that. Now, if people have questions, perhaps they would put them in the chat. Nicholas, to quote a present-day political leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, he talks about 4,000 years of Jewish history, as though this was a clear and continuous and understood narrative. I think what you're saying is this is just absolute nonsense. I mean, when I read some of the passages in Genesis, I wonder what was in the mind of the authors when they quote God directly, telling people what to do and where to go. Do you think that they intended their readers to accept that as literally true, or did everybody know they were just spinning a yarn?
Well, I think we need to recognize two things. I think, yeah, certainly there are many centuries, millennia of history in continuity with Jews today would stand, whether they are Zionist or not. But it is not a single unbroken continuum involving political domination of the area that would now be known as Palestine or Israel. I mean, it's a very much more complicated history, and who was in and who was out of the various groupings that consolidated around the monarchy and later dispersed, changed a great deal over time, as happens with other groups in other contexts at any other time. Cultural groups are fluid. They are and dynamic. They are not static. Otherwise, they perish. So I think that is one thing to recognise. I mean, that although we can look back over a heritage going back millennia, what we read into it may not be quite as it was, and others may have other claims on that same heritage, and it is certainly not the case that all who profess Jewish identity, however they define it today, are necessarily descended from the people who were identified themselves as the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. So I think that those points are relevant to your first question, and I think your other point is really how to do with how encounters between God and humanity are understood in different cultures, and just as in faith communities today, people can sincerely believe they are being called by God to do particular things, that their spiritual lives involve communion with God, and their lives are directed. And some may speak of God disclosing God's will in particular ways, verbally or visually. But the way it is interpreted and the significance accorded to such experiences is in many ways culturally determined. Not so much spinning a yarn as giving an account in a particular cultural medium of how it was understood that God and humanity had interacted, or God in particular, human beings had interacted at a particular time to bring about a situation as it exists at the time of writing. Am I making?
Yeah, can I go on to some questions that have come up in the chat? Here's one which asks, is there anywhere in Scripture which could be interpreted as giving the land to those who today call themselves Jews, although the vast majority have no genetic links to the region?
I think, once again, I think that is a perhaps a more complex question than may have at first sight appear. I'm not a geneticist. I do not profess to understand the way the evidence is gathered and interpreted. But like all areas of science, many of the details are contested, and in most branches of science, it is possible to manipulate the data to find what one is looking for, and so the game can be played both ways. But I do not believe that there is anywhere in the Hebrew prophets, and it's only in the prophets that we can really look, because it is self-evident that whatever promises may have been made to David or earlier to Moses or to Abraham, came to a pretty abrupt end when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, and even if the majority of people remained on the land, only to be in many ways to be dispossessed by returning exiles a couple of generations later. The Hebrew kingdom came to an end. There was no political independence there until the very brief period of Hasmonean rule in the second, first century BCE, and then from the Roman period until 1948. So I mean, quite clearly, there has not been continuous possession of the land. There's never been a time when there have been no Jewish people living there, or in many other places. And the point is not whether Jewish people may have ties to that particular area of land, but whether they're entitled to dispossess other people who have ties at least as strong or stronger than theirs, and do have continuous occupation in their heritage. So once one makes genetics an argument for possession, we could all probably claim to the right to dispossess anybody of anywhere else. I mean, I think that's a fairly it's not a formula that makes for a human peaceful coexistence.
Let's go on to the next question. Who are the descendants of Abraham? And you've already put a question mark there, I think, about whether Abraham is a historical personality or not. But who are the descendants of Abraham? Jews, Muslims, Christians, all of the above?
Well, I mean, if one takes the narrative, and that's the only way we can really answer, if Abraham was a historical figure, his descendants would be identified with those of Ishmael and also of Isaac, and he also had other children in his old age. And he seemed to have rather more fecundity in the last years of his life than he had in the first 100. So there are quite a lot of different, some who may be identifiable by tradition with later groups who claim the same names, but it is really not possible to say that one particular personal group of people is descended from Abraham, but others are not. And in Christian tradition, as articulated by Paul, descent from Abraham is understood in a spiritual sense, and rather than biological, and without wishing to be supersessionist, and that is how Paul taught in Christ we are all Abraham's descendants, whether Jew, Greek, slave, free, male or female, and that doesn't mean that people who are not Christian will understand it that way. Genealogies that have been reconstructed on the basis of the biblical narrative would suggest.
Now, here's a question. Is it relevant to look at the ethical teachings through the Hebrew scriptures with regard to the treatment of the alien, the stranger, and other vulnerable groups?
I would be very cautious on that, because I think that could be taken to identify the Palestinians as aliens from the land in which they live, which is not the case. They are the indigenous population of the land. They're not aliens, and the ethical principle of treating them justly would certainly be relevant. But that's relevant to how we treat anybody. But I think passages like that can be used to marginalize and relegate people, and I think we need to be cautious on that.
Mm-hmm. So be careful. Don't allow it to marginalize Palestinians who are indigenous people in the area. Now, here's a question about the story of Naboth's vineyard. How might Jewish or Christian Zionists interpret this story?
Well, it's a very interesting story within the history of the Northern Kingdom, and we see the conflict between the Hebrew tradition of land tenure that Naboth represents, and at the outset of the story, Ahab feels constrained to acknowledge, and that is the transmission through families of with safety nets to prevent the accumulation of property by particular individuals. And on the other hand, the ideology of the city-states, represented by Jezebel, who, according to the narrative, is the daughter of the king of one of the Phoenician city-states, who looks upon all land as being at the disposal of the king and for him to take. And the judicial lynching of Naboth is the means to asserting royal ownership, supplanting the traditional system of land tenure within families, because not only was Naboth himself put to death, but his family, by implication, were dispossessed. They were not able to inherit the vineyard. So it tells us something of the way in which the monarchy changed Israelite society, overthrew traditional, more egalitarian patterns of land tenure, and established a society in which a very few controlled the wealth and power, and others were reduced to subservience, if not servitude. It's not an ethnic conflict as such. It's an ideological one.
Yeah, it's a story that I've always found very powerful. And I imagine that Zionists, whether Jewish secular Zionists or Christian Zionists, probably have no problem with the taking over of land. They see that as being in line with divine will.
Mm-hmm.
Now here's a question. I don't know where Alistair Moody lives, but he's saying, is it likely that Americans see parallels between the colonization of their country, their promised land, with the genocide of Native Americans and the colonization of Palestine by successive waves of Europeans? And I suppose we could also talk about Africa, we could talk about Australia, we could talk about many places where settler colonial people have dominated and displaced those who were living there. So,
yes, and Ireland, of course.
Well, yeah.
And I think I expect that most Americans and possibly most Australians are either oblivious or in denial of the extent of the genocide that accompanied the colonization of the land. And the same was true in the Caribbean, and it wasn't only in what is now the United States. That either disease or massacre, displaced and caused countless deaths. By some estimates, up to 90% of the population. So that certainly happened, and no doubt, and it certainly happened in parts of Asia over the centuries as well. And the irony of human history is many occasions refugees from whether from war, famine, dispossession of one kind, become the perpetrators of the same atrocities wherever they try to establish themselves thereafter. The moral question is whether, in order to ensure their own survival, that is a legitimate course of action to take, and that is debated in various religious traditions, but we're certainly seeing a kind of white supremacist triumphalism in North America at the moment. In the United States, at any rate, such more blatant than perhaps has been the case for decades. There's certainly resurgent racism in Europe, and to what extent people are conscious of the dispossession of other human beings, or consider them their own ethnic superiority to justify it, or divine chosenness, drove in the idea that God gave people particular land. I mean, is certainly a common thread in not only in the Zionists, in Christian and Jewish, as far as Palestine and Israel is concerned. I mean, it was certainly part of the apartheid ideology in South Africa, and it's attested also in the kind of plantation Scots in Ireland, and there are elements of it in some of the settlements in North America also. People did believe it, and but not everyone who found themselves in a place they perhaps did not choose to migrate to necessarily believed that, and not everybody behaved in the same way. But I think it's how self-interest is dressed up is really what the kind of power games of the present are really about.
Alistair comes in with a supplementary saying that he's thinking in particular of the support by successive United States governments for the state of Israel. And well, I imagine that many of those governments don't really see what happened to the indigenous peoples of North America as being a tragedy. They probably take the view that civilization swept away these savages and replaced them by a much better kind of people. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, and there's a Trump's phrase, "We tamed a continent." Says it all. But I mean, that's and the sense of ethnic superiority, certainly drove much of the European imperial project in many parts of the world, but it was also economic self-interest.
Nicholas, we've come to the end of the questions that are up on the board. So what I want to do in conclusion is just to say thank you to you, Nicholas, for the talk you've given. We will make that available, and I certainly want to follow up some of that myself, and I look forward to the suggested reading that you will make. And thanks to everybody who is still with us. I see that 37 people are still there. Kairos Ireland with other people are working to try to support justice for Palestinians, and we're particularly concerned in Ireland at the moment that our government seems to be backpedaling on the Occupied Territories Bill. So we need to galvanize people and make sure that we remain committed to the issue of justice that has already been enunciated by politicians. But anyway, thanks, Nicholas, and we'll say goodbye to our audience, to the people who are out there.